Hey, happy Thursday. Hope everybody is having a great week. I wanted to talk about the SAVE Act and why it's important. I was actually having a debate with one of my left leaning friends who actually, I think, like most people, agrees that voter ID as a requirement is non controversial. Um, but she was one of these cases where um, she was, I guess, getting ready to go on a trip. Um, and she's married, she has kids, and she changed her last name. And so she was like, well, I'm going through all this stuff to get my passport renewed or my new passport, and I need to show all this proof because I changed my name. Um, and then I was kind of saying, okay, and like you have the documents, and so it was kind of like she was saying, I don't think that it should be a requirement, and I'm like, well, there's a bunch of states that don't require vote or ID to vote. Or to register to vote. And I'm like, this kind of enshrines that into the process. But at any rate, I kind of wanted to start with kind of how you get to the SAVE Act. We'll start with uh, voter fraud. And I'm immune to conspiracy theories, I should say. Um, but there are some things that are portrayed in the media as never happening. Or actually, the way that voter fraud or election fraud is talked about in the media is they won't say that it doesn't happen. They just say, well, it doesn't happen enough to affect the outcome of an election. And that is not true. They can say that for the presidential election, but it definitely affects elections. And I'll kind of get into that. Um, but they'll say why no widespread voter fraud. Okay, every year there are multiple cases of voter fraud, and so you can kind of like see, okay, well, these are the cases that were caught. How many cases weren't caught? You can make some assumptions, or you could be on the side that just says, just plugs their eyes and their ears, and just says, "Oh, this isn't happening. It's not real." Well, um, in my research, a nationwide investigative analysis identified 410 instances since 2016 in which which voter or election fraud led to a criminal conviction or a court conviction or court action. About 96% of these involve fraudulent registration, but not a vote cast, or misconduct at the ballot boxes is ballot stuffing. And 14 of those resulted in a new election being ordered, all local elections with smaller margins. Um, but nonetheless, it's happening. It's publicized, but it's not covered. um, Fox News might cover it, Newsmax might cover it, but MS MS Now, CNN, ABC, CBS News, like they're not covering this stuff. They just kind of turn a blind eye to it. But the most common forms of voter fraud kind of break down like this, right? So the most frequently documented is fraudulent use of absentee ballots or mail-in ballots. The second is false or fraudulent voter registrations. Third is duplicate voting. Fourth is in-person impersonation. This is voting, going to the polls and actually voting, but saying you're someone else. Um, Ineligible voting happens a little bit. This could happen if you haven't met the eligibility requirements within the state. So, like, let's say you're a new resident. There's a certain amount of time in some states where you can't apply to vote. Um, And so there is some ineligibility there. There's also, if you're a felon in certain states and haven't had your rights restored, you might be an ineligible voter. Then there's also ballot tampering and altering the vote count, which doesn't happen or isn't documented as much as the ones that I mentioned earlier. But of those 14 cases where the elections had to actually be undone and then redone, there's number one, again, goes back to absentee and mail in ballots, which is the most common occurrence. Brighton, Alabama mayoral race in 2016, a judge determined 46 fraudulent absentee ballots were cast for the winner, some unsigned, mailed to the wrong address, or from people who voted in person. The mayor was ordered to vacate the office. Similar absentee schemes have appeared in local Florida and North Carolina races. Second, voting by coercion or procurement. Eatonville, Florida, town council race for March of 2020, the challenger, Marlon Daniels, lost by a razor thin margin after two ballots were found invalid. One voter testified he never voted at all. Another was directed how to vote and transported to the polls by a landlord in exchange for forgiving back rent during the early pandemic. A judge ruled the votes were illegally procured, overturned the results, and seated Daniels. There was ballot tampering, harvesting, and stuffing. If you watch the 2000 Mules documentary, this is what they talked about most in there. In certain states, it's illegal to ballot harvest, which also leads to stuffing ballot boxes. But this is all done by mail-in votes mostly. But there were two examples I wanted to hit on here. So North Carolina 9th Congressional District in 2018, a Republican operative and associates engaged in illegal ballot harvesting and tampering with absentee ballots. The state elections board refused to certify the initial results and ordered a new election. So that happened. And then there was one that actually made the news. At least I definitely saw it on Fox, and I saw it mentioned a lot being shared online, which is the Bridgeport, Connecticut Democrat mayoral primary in 2023. Evidence of ballot stuffing led a judge to order the primary rerun. And the ballot stuffing was done by somebody who worked for the government in the election office. So that one, she ended up getting prosecuted. I believe she got jail time. So those are the ones that I wanted to hit on. But what I find interesting is ultimately like why the SAVE Act is there. And again, I had this debate and I was talking about the fact that certain jurisdictions allow non-citizens to vote in local elections only. This is not statewide. But California, DC, Maryland, and Vermont all have municipalities that have passed regulations to allow non-citizens to vote. In California, it's Oakland and San Francisco. DC is just one jurisdiction. In Maryland, it's Barnesville, Brentwood, Cheverly, Chevy Chase, Colmore Manor, Edmundston, Frederick, Garrett Park, Glen Echo, Greenbelt, Hyattsville, Martin's Additions, Mount Rainier, Riverdale Park, Somerset, and Tacoma Park in Maryland. In Vermont, it's Burlington, Montpelier, and Winooski. All of those places allow non-citizens to vote. Now, the question is, why is it important for those jurisdictions to add non-voters or citizens to their voter rolls. And when I say non-citizens, I'm not talking about illegal individuals, although there is probably a question there. These are people that um, are U.S. citizens. They might have a green card. They might have some kind of immigration status, legal immigration status, that then allows them to register to vote. But within all four of those states, there is no voter ID required. And to vote, there is no strict photo ID required, for registration. So no voter ID to vote, no strict photo ID required for registration in California, Vermont, Maryland, or DC. So they're not requiring ID to register. They're not requiring ID to vote. They're allowing non-citizens to register to vote in elections. There's no real way to see who is actually voting. Um, at any rate, take that for what you will. But the SAVE Act kind of, it just ends that. And this is this was like the circular conversation I was having with my friend, is that if these states, and by the way, these are just the states that allow non-citizens to vote. There are plenty of other states that enforce regulations to not require voter ID to vote. But so number one on the list for the SAVE Act is documented proof of citizenship for registration, for registering to vote. This can be done with a real ID, a valid U.S. passport, a military ID, government issued ID. And there's some other government ID plus supporting documents like birth certificates, naturalization certificate, birth abroad. There's a certificate for that, a report for that. Hospital birth record, adoption decree. There's things like that. But also, if you don't have a real ID, you can use a standard driver's license in combination with one of those other IDs, whether it be a passport, your birth certificate, your social security number, or social security card, or whatever. And so that can happen. It requires in-person registration. So you've got to be in person to register to vote, and you've got to provide a proof of citizenship to do that. But this eliminates the online and mail-in registration that's currently available across many states. Voter ID to cast a ballot requires government issue photo ID to vote in person. Again, this is for federal elections. States can still do whatever they want to do for their state and local elections, but this standardizes the way in which we vote as U.S. citizens in federal elections only. It also requires voter roll maintenance, so states must take steps to remove non-citizens from rolls using verified information. It also requires ongoing programs to identify and remove ineligible voters. And this requires data sharing with DHS. Again, I don't think these are controversial. And based on current polling, it's over 75%. So 3/4 of US citizens want this to pass. And this is bipartisan. This isn't a Republican thing. I get tired of having dumb debates on like whether or not you need ID to vote when we need ID to literally do anything else. I bought a house. I needed an ID for that. You use a check. If for those of people who still do that, there are a lot of retirees use checks. You got to show ID. When you go to buy alcohol, you got to show ID. When you want to go buy cigarettes, you got to show ID. If you want to go to any bar, especially if you're a local, I can speak to New York City, um, Northern Virginia and DC, North Carolina, at least in the Raleigh Durham area. You need ID. You have to have ID to get in. They will not let you in. I just also find it just hilarious that the same people that were requiring vaccine passports to get into restaurants, bars, and basically do anything in New York City are all of a sudden saying, "Oh no, you don't need ID to vote. You shouldn't have to get ID. Oh, people will have a hard time getting ID." Meanwhile, they forced everybody to get a vaccine passport to be able to function um, in New York City and in other places as well. Um, but it's non-controversial. Um, the Save Act needs to pass. It's super annoying that the House has passed it and it's sitting in the Senate right now, and John Thune is kind of holding it up. Um, it makes no sense, other than the fact that I think like senators in general, and this is Republicans, Democrats, um, or independents, Bernie Sanders, who still votes Democrat, um, like they want to maintain a bit of power. They don't want to be told what to do. Um, so, you know, they don't want to listen to the will of people at this current moment. They might end up passing it. Who knows? But as of today, um, they haven't passed it. And it needs to get passed, right? I think if we want to have secure elections and we don't want to have questions about elections, voter ID should be a requirement. Voter rolls should be open to the federal government, to essentially validate whether or not someone is a U.S. citizen, which they would have the information for, and non-citizens should not be on the same voter rolls or voter rolls at all, um, for federal elections. Not to say that non-citizens are voting in federal elections, but given the fact that you don't need ID to register to vote, that you don't need ID to vote, um, logic would tell you that yes, there are people that are registered to vote that may or may not be citizens, that may or may not have physical addresses, um, within the jurisdictions in which they're voting. There's no way to validate that because, again, if you don't require voter ID to do literally any of this stuff to register or to vote, then how do you actually track that? I think that's the point in some of these states, is to muddy the waters. But at any rate, let me know what you think in the comment section below. Should the SAVE Act pass? Am I completely off base here? Let me know. But as always, keep believing that the best for America is still ahead. Peace.